Do you think there are words that Chamberlain should have said, could have said, that put more pressure on Hitler, intimidate Hitler more?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. It's such a difficult one because you're always looking at it through, the enemy has a vote and you don't know what that vote is going to be and you don't know what it's going to look like. There's no question that Europe, the rest of Europe is cowed by the kind of impression of military might that the Germans have put out. They certainly fear they are stronger than they actually are. And then on the other hand, they're also going, yeah, but Germany doesn't have natural resources, doesn't have access to the world's oceans. It's kind of, it shouldn't be able to win a war, and so they're kind of contradicting themselves at the same time. So in 1 minute they're sort of going, oh god, you don't want to take on all those Nazis and all those swastikas and those automaton stormtroopers. But on the other hand, they're then saying, but actually Germany doesn't have much in its kind of, in its basket. It's got actually quite a lot of weaknesses and we should be able to kind of prevail, blah, blah, blah. We'll just impose an economic blockade and then it'll be stuffed. And Britain is not ready to fight a war in 1938, but nor is Hitler, nor is Germany. So, one is sort of striking out the other. But it's very easy to say that in hindsight. But at the time, with people kind of digging trenches in Hyde Park in central London and barrage balloons going up over London and, children being evacuated from the cities and 92% of the population not wanting to go to war, you can see why he takes the course he does. I suppose that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's necessarily the right decision, but I think it's an understandable decision.
Oh, but what about even just on the human level? If I go into a room with a British gentleman versus going to a room with Trump, it feels like it's so much easier to read and manipulate the British gentleman because Trump is like Trump-like characters. It seems like Hitler is similar. Churchill is similar. It's like this guy can do anything. There's something terrifying about the
unpredictability.
Yeah. It feels like there's something very predictable about Chamberlain.
Yes, I think that's true. But also one has to take a step back and think about what Britain represents. So therefore what Chamberlain represents in 1938. Britain has the largest empire the world has ever known in 1938.
We shouldn't forget that.
A third of the world is pink, as the saying goes, and that saying comes from the kind of atlas of the world where all British territories are kind of colored pink.
Yeah.
And on top of that, it has lots of extra imperial territories as well. So, if you look at, there's this incredible map of global shipping in 1937. And there's these little ant lines of ships going out. And one of the strongest ant lines is going down to Argentina and South America from Britain. So down past West Africa and down the Southern Atlantic, and there it is. And that's because Britain owns most of Argentina. It owns huge, great farming estates and ranches. It owns the railway system. It owns many of the port facilities. So you didn't even need an empire. You just need the facilities that overseas trade and possessions can give you. And Britain not only has the largest navy, it also has the largest merchant navy. It has 33% of the world's merchant shipping and access to a further 50%, Greek, Norwegian, Canadian shipping that it can access. So if you've got access to in excess of 80% of the world shipping, that puts you in an incredibly strong position. And actually, all sorts of other things have been going on. While they might not have been creating a huge army or producing enough Spitfires that they might want to up until this point, what they have also been doing is stockpiling bauxite and copper and tungsten and huge reserves. And because Britain has this huge global reach and because it has its empire and its extra imperial assets, it can strike bargains that no one else can strike. So it can go into various countries around the world and can go, okay, I want you to guarantee me for the next 5 years every bit of your rubber supply. I will pay over the asking price to secure that. And it's doing that in the 1930s. So when war comes, it's got everything it possibly needs. Now, you always need more because it's suddenly turning into a kind of, a proper global, long, drawn-out war. But that is a huge advantage. So it is with that mindset that Chamberlain is going into those talks and thinking, okay, well, I'm not going to go to war over the Czechoslovakian. Who cares about them? But but I am going to show Hitler that I mean business. Hitler's going, who's this stuffy guy with his white hair? I don't give a toss about him, and he's coming at it from a completely different perspective. And I think one of the things that's so interesting from a dramatic point of view and from a historian's point of view, or even a novelist's point of view, in the case of Robert Harris writing his book about these negotiations, which I don't know if you've read it, but it's terrifically good. Is the fact you've got two alpha males, who are going to those negotiations from totally different perspectives and vantage points. And I think it's very easy for people today to forget how elevated Britain was in the late 1930s. The gold standard was tied to the pound, not the dollar. And so Britain was the number one nation in the world at that time. And it just was. And it's so diminished by comparison today that it's hard to imagine it. And I think one of the interesting things about the historiography, about the narrative of how we tell World War II, is that so much of it has been dictated by the shift in power that took place subsequent to 1945. And when people were starting to write these sort of major narratives in the 1970s and 80s and into the 1990s, is through a prism of a very, very different world. And so one of the reasons why you have this narrative that Britain was a bit rubbish and hanging on the shirt tails of the Americans, and all the blood was spilt in Eastern Front, and Germany had the best army in the world and was only defeated because Hitler was mad and blah blah blah. That kind of, sort of traditional narrative. It's that narrative emerges through the prism of what was going on in the 1970s and what was going on in the 1980s and the changing world, rather than looking at it through the prism of the late 1930s or early 1940s.
Still, there is this moment of decision. When do you think, what lesson do you take from that? When is the right time for appeasement, to negotiate, for diplomacy, and when is the right time for military strength, offensive, attacking, for military conflict? Where's that line? Where's that?
Well, I kind of think it probably was when it was. I mean,
Poland.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm not sure it would have been the right decision to go to war in 1938. I think it would. I can't predict, because you can't second guess how things are going to play out, because you just don't know. But I'm not sure that Chamberlain made the wrong decision. I'm not saying he made the right decision. I'm just like, I'm being a bit wishy-washy about this.
You could have threatened it more. Imagine Churchill in those same meetings.
Yeah, but Churchill also appeases. I mean, he appeases Stalin all the time. I mean, so the idea that Churchill's this big, strong man and never appeases, and, he's gung-ho for war. Churchill's out of the government at that time. He recognizes that you can't trust Hitler. He recognizes that Nazism is bad. But because he's out of the government, he doesn't have a window on exactly where Britain is at that particular time in a way that Chamberlain does. So I suppose what I'm saying is Chamberlain is better placed to make those decisions than Churchill is, which again doesn't mean that Chamberlain is right and Churchill is wrong. It's just, that's a massive punt to go to war in 1938 when you still don't have, you've got a handful of Spitfires, you've got a handful of Hurricanes, you haven't got enough, your air defense system isn't properly sorted at this point. Your Navy is strong. But, what's that going to look like? I mean, if you do go to war. Because there's not going to be armies sweeping into Germany. It's going to be accelerated industrialization for a year. So, no, even if you go to war in 1938 over Czechoslovakia will not be saved. France and Britain will not be going and invading Germany. That is absolutely not going to happen. So, sort of, what's the point? I mean, if you're not going to do that, why didn't you accelerate your rearmament thereafter? Get your ducks in a row, and then you can consider it. I mean, after all, even in September 1939, they don't really do anything. I mean, we talked about the Saar offensive, which isn't really an offensive at all. It's firing one round of machine gun and scuttling back again. But I mean, they don't even do that then. They're still buying time in 1939. And, Britain is only just about ready to take on the onslaught of the Luftwaffe in summer of 1940.